You want mental toughness fast, overnight, like it's an app you download or a switch you flip. That impatience is exactly why you don't have it. Weak men crave instant transformation because they're terrified of slow exposure. They want the result without the process, the status without the scars. Let me make this uncomfortable right now. If toughness were instant, you'd already have it and you don't. Here's the shock you don't want to hear. Mental toughness doesn't arrive in a moment of intensity. It shows up after boredom, after repetition, after doing the same hard thing when nobody is watching and nothing feels cinematic. Your mind isn't impressed by your emotions. It only respects patterns. And your patterns right now? Soft, inconsistent, predictable. That's why your potential keeps rotting instead of turning into power. You've been lied to about transformation. You think change sounds like a motivational speech in your head. That's fantasy. Real change feels like speaking a language you don't fully understand yet. That's what speaking in tongues really is, not religion, not mysticism. It's when your actions start speaking before your comfort does. When discipline moves faster than doubt. When your behavior sends signals your old identity can't decode anymore. At first, it feels awkward, forced, unnatural. Of course it does. You're interrupting a weak operating system. You're acting like a man you haven't become yet. That's the point. Speaking in tongues is when your habits speak the language of dominance before your emotions catch up. You train, you work, you execute. Not because you feel like it, but because that's what the new identity demands. Most men quit right here. Why? Because they mistake discomfort for failure. They think confusion means they're doing it wrong. No. Confusion means the old version of you is losing authority. Your mind is scrambling because control is shifting. That's power being installed. Slowly, brutally, permanently. Discipline is the translator. Control is the grammar. Repetition is the accent. Every day you act against weakness. You speak this new language more fluently, and eventually something terrifying happens. Your old excuses stop making sense. The comfort zone loses its voice. You don't feel motivated. You feel obligated. That's dominance. That's when you stop negotiating with yourself and start issuing commands. Mental toughness isn't instant because instant things don't own you. They entertain you. Real toughness rewires you. It strips you of emotional dependency and replaces it with standards. And standards don't ask how you feel. They tell you what's happening next. Most men are in a hurry because they're scared of time. They want strength now, confidence now, respect now, because waiting would force them to confront who they really are. And who they really are at this moment isn't impressive. That's the part no one wants to admit. Impatience isn't ambition. It's avoidance. It's the refusal to sit long enough in discomfort for real change to take shape. The man demanding instant toughness isn't hungry for power. He's running from the slow exposure that reveals weakness layer by layer. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Anything that arrives instantly carries no weight. It doesn't reshape you. It doesn't demand anything from you. It entertains you and leaves. Real mental toughness is heavy. It presses on you daily. It forces adjustments in how you think, move, speak, and decide. That kind of pressure cannot be compressed into a moment without breaking the structure entirely. The men chasing fast transformation don't realize they're chasing something fragile, something that collapses the first time life pushes back. Look closely at the obsession with speed and you'll see addiction, not discipline. The modern man is trained to expect immediate reward. Swipe, click, consume, move on. That same mindset poisons his attempt at strength. He tries to treat toughness like content, something to be absorbed rather than earned. But strength isn't information, it's conditioning. And conditioning only works through prolonged stress applied without escape. That process feels slow because it's supposed to. Slowness is the filter. It removes the unserious. The demand for instant results is also a quiet confession. It says, I don't trust myself to stay consistent. That's why shortcuts feel attractive. That's why intensity is mistaken for progress. A burst of effort gives the illusion of change without requiring loyalty to the process. But loyalty is the currency of power. Without it, nothing sticks. The man who can only perform when he's excited is unreliable. And unreliable men don't get respect from others or from themselves. Mental toughness built slowly does something. Speed can't replicate. It embeds itself into identity. When you show up on hard days without applause, without visible progress, without emotional reward, you're teaching your nervous system a brutal lesson. Action is not conditional. Over time, that lesson becomes automatic. You stop debating. You stop seeking permission from your moods. You move because that's who you are. That shift cannot happen instantly because identities don't update like software. They're carved through repetition and resistance. The truth most people avoid is this: if mental toughness were instant, weak men would have it too. There would be no hierarchy, no edge, no separation. Difficulty is the gatekeeper. Time is the test. The slow pace isn't a flaw in the process, it's the security system. It ensures only those willing to endure boredom, frustration, and delayed gratification make it through. Everyone else self-eliminates and then complains that the system is unfair. What looks like patience in strong men is actually confidence in inevitability. They're not rushing because they know the outcome is guaranteed if they don't quit. Weak men rush because they're unsure. They need proof now, or they lose faith. That lack of faith is why they never build anything durable. They keep restarting, rebranding, reimagining anything except staying put long enough for pressure to do its work. The men who eventually command respect are rarely the loudest at the beginning. They're the ones who stayed when nothing was happening. They allowed time to harden them instead of entertaining themselves with speed. They understood that instant gratification creates dependency, while delayed results create authority. And authority is the real prize. Not the feeling of being strong, but the reality of being unbreakable. You think your mind listens to your intentions. It doesn't. It listens to your behavior. Say whatever you want in your head. Promise yourself anything at night. Write goals. Visualize success. It's all irrelevant if your actions aren't consistent. The brain is a pattern recognition machine. It believes what you repeat, not what you declare. That's why most men feel powerless. Their words point one direction, their habits point another, and the mind always sides with the evidence. One hard day doesn't change you. One burst of discipline doesn't impress your nervous system. Intensity without repetition is just emotional noise. You can train brutally for a week, wake up early for 10 days, eat clean for a month, and your mind will still label you as unreliable if you break the pattern. Why? Because consistency is credibility. Until your actions become predictable under pressure, your mind refuses to grant you authority. This is where self-deception thrives. Men confuse effort with identity. They think because something felt difficult, it must have counted. Difficulty isn't the metric, frequency is. The mind doesn't care how painful something was once. It cares whether it can expect that behavior again tomorrow. If the answer is no, it categorizes the action as an exception, not a rule. Exceptions don't shape identity. Rules do. Repetition is how you teach your mind who's in charge. Every time you do the hard thing again without novelty, without excitement, you send a signal. This is standard. Over time, resistance weakens because resistance feeds on uncertainty. When the action becomes inevitable, the mind stops arguing. That's willpower. Not forcing yourself through willpower every day, but removing the debate entirely. Most men avoid repetition because repetition is exposing. The first time you do something hard, ego can hide inside adrenaline. The second time, it can lean on memory. The 10th time, there's nowhere to hide. Repetition strips the performance away and reveals whether you're serious. That's why people love starting and hate maintaining. Starting feels heroic. Maintaining feels honest. Your identity is nothing more than the sum of your repeated behaviors, not your beliefs, not your aspirations, not your potential. What you do regularly becomes who you are, whether you like it or not. If your actions are inconsistent, your identity is unstable. And an unstable identity cannot produce confidence, discipline, or calm under pressure. It produces anxiety and overthinking instead. This is also why motivation is unreliable. Motivation is an emotional spike, and emotions are temporary by design. Repetition is mechanical. It doesn't care about your mood. When you rely on repetition, you stop gambling your progress on how you feel that day. You move from emotional living to structured living. That transition is where mental toughness actually begins. The men who dominate their own minds aren't more passionate. They're more predictable. Their behavior follows a narrow range regardless of circumstances. They train when tired. They work when bored. They execute when distracted. That predictability creates trust within the mind. And when the mind trusts you, it stops sabotaging you with doubt and hesitation. If you're still struggling with confidence, discipline, or control, look at your patterns, not your intentions, not your speeches. Patterns don't lie. Repetition is the mirror that shows you exactly who you are. Until that mirror reflects consistency, your mind will never submit to you. The moment discomfort shows up, most men assume something is wrong. They read resistance as a warning sign, a signal to slow down, reassess, or quit. That reflex alone explains why they stay weak. Discomfort isn't danger, it's unfamiliarity. And unfamiliarity is the tax you pay for growth. The men who retreat at the first sign of internal friction aren't protecting themselves. They're preserving the version of themselves that needs to die. Every meaningful upgrade in identity feels wrong at first. Not painful in a dramatic sense, but awkward, unstable, mentally irritating. Your routines feel off. Your confidence dips. Your mind starts questioning decisions that were fine yesterday. That's not failure. That's the system recalibrating. When you challenge old patterns, the brain responds with friction because friction is how it defends the status quo. Comfort is not peace. Comfort is inertia. Weak men interpret discomfort emotionally. Strong men interpret it strategically. One group asks, why does this feel bad? The other asks, what is this feeling trying to protect? And the answer is always the same: the old identity, the lazy schedule, the excuses, the self-image built on avoiding pressure. Discomfort shows up precisely when that structure is threatened. Treating it as a stop sign guarantees you never threaten anything meaningful again. There's a reason discomfort feels personal. It attacks the ego directly. It exposes gaps between who you think you are and what your behavior proves. That exposure is humiliating for the undisciplined mind, so it reframes discomfort as danger, burnout, or not the right time. That reframing is survival, not intelligence. It's the ego scrambling to maintain relevance. Men who build real toughness don't romanticize discomfort, but they don't dramatize it either. They understand its neutral data. It doesn't mean push harder blindly. It means stay present and continue executing. When you repeatedly act while uncomfortable, you teach your nervous system a critical lesson. Discomfort does not control outcomes. That lesson alone separates leaders from followers. The mistake most men make is waiting for discomfort to disappear before continuing. That never happens. Discomfort fades only after the behavior becomes normal, and normal only comes through repetition. If you stop every time resistance appears, resistance becomes permanent. If you move through it, resistance loses authority. The feeling doesn't vanish because you felt brave once. It weakens because it stopped working. This is why comfort is more dangerous than pain. Pain demands attention. Comfort numbs awareness. Comfort convinces you that nothing needs to change. Discomfort does the opposite. It exposes inefficiencies, weaknesses, and lies you've been telling yourself. It shows you exactly where growth is required. Avoiding it is choosing ignorance over power. The men who eventually develop calm, unshakable confidence didn't eliminate discomfort from their lives. They outgrew it. They spent so much time functioning under mild resistance that resistance stopped registering as a threat. What used to feel heavy became background noise. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens by refusing to treat discomfort as a veto. If you're uncomfortable right now, pay attention. That sensation is information. It's pointing to a boundary you've never crossed consistently. On the other side of that boundary is skill, authority, and self-respect. Staying on this side feels safe, but it costs you momentum. Crossing it feels unstable, but it builds control. Discomfort isn't telling you to stop. It's asking a question. Are you serious or are you pretending? How you answer determines whether it becomes a permanent barrier or a temporary sensation you barely remember once you've moved past it. Most men let their emotions sit in the driver's seat and then wonder why their lives keep crashing. They wait to feel ready, confident, motivated, aligned. That waiting is the quietest form of weakness. Feelings are reactive by nature. They respond to circumstances, comfort, fatigue, fear. When you allow emotion to lead, you hand control to whatever mood shows up that day. And moods are unreliable, undisciplined, and easily manipulated. Action is different. Action is assertive. It doesn't ask for permission from your internal state. It moves first and forces the mind to catch up. That's the part most people can't accept. They've been conditioned to believe that feeling comes before doing. In reality, it's the opposite. Feeling follows action. Confidence follows execution. Clarity follows movement. Waiting for emotion to lead is like waiting for the weather to give you approval before building strength. You'll be waiting forever. The need to feel ready is usually fear wearing a polite mask. It sounds reasonable, it sounds self-aware, but underneath, it's avoidance. Because if you act without emotional certainty, you lose your favorite excuse. You can no longer blame hesitation on confusion or timing. You're exposed. And exposure is exactly what weak systems try to avoid. High-functioning men understand a brutal truth early. Emotions are feedback, not commands. They notice how they feel, but they don't negotiate with it. Tired? Irrelevant. Unmotivated? Expected. Doubtful? Normal. None of those states disqualify action. They're background noise. When action becomes the standard response regardless of internal conditions, emotional volatility loses its power. Most people never experience this shift because they keep outsourcing responsibility to their feelings. They say things like, "I didn't feel like it," as if that's a valid reason. It isn't. It's a confession. It says your inner world controls your outer behavior. That hierarchy guarantees inconsistency, and inconsistency guarantees weakness. When action leads, something uncomfortable happens at first. You feel misaligned. You feel mechanical. You feel like you're acting without authenticity. That's because your current emotional identity hasn't caught up to your new behavior yet. That gap is not a problem. That gap is the process. Over time, the emotions adapt to the standard you enforce. The mind always rationalizes what the body repeatedly does. This is how discipline replaces motivation. Motivation spikes and crashes. Discipline doesn't spike, it stays flat and effective. Men who rely on motivation live in cycles of intensity and collapse. Men who rely on action live in progression. They don't need to hype themselves up because execution is no longer emotionally expensive. There's also a status shift that happens internally. When you act despite resistance, your mind starts treating you differently. It stops questioning every decision. It stops generating excessive doubt. Why? Because you've proven you don't need perfect conditions to move. Reliability creates trust. And when the mind trusts you, it stops sabotaging you with hesitation. Emotion-led living feels human, but it's unstable. Action-led living feels rigid at first, but it creates freedom. Freedom from internal chaos. Freedom from constant self-negotiation. Freedom from needing the right mood to show up. That freedom is what people mistake for confidence. If you want control, you don't chase feelings. You train them by ignoring their objections. Over time, emotions fall in line with the behavior you repeat. They soften, they stabilize, they stop demanding attention. Not because you suppress them, but because you prove they aren't in charge. Men who wait to feel ready stay stuck in potential. Men who act first rewrite their emotional baseline. One group reacts to life, the other dictates terms. And the difference has nothing to do with talent or luck. It comes down to a simple decision made daily. Do you move when it's comfortable, or do you move because movement is the rule? Most men never realize the real reason discipline feels foreign to them. It's not because it's hard, it's because it speaks a language their current identity doesn't recognize. When you begin acting beyond your comfort, your old self can't translate what's happening. The routines don't match the excuses. The standards don't match the self-image. That internal confusion isn't a problem, it's the signal that you've stepped outside the limits of who you used to be. Weak identity survives on familiarity. It knows how to procrastinate. It knows how to rationalize. It knows how to delay without guilt. Discipline disrupts that entire system. When you wake up early without drama, train without hype, work without validation, the old identity starts losing relevance. It can't explain your behavior anymore, so it panics. That panic shows up as resistance, doubt, and the urge to slow down. None of that means you're doing something wrong. It means you're doing something irreversible. This is where most men retreat. They mistake internal confusion for misalignment. They think, "This doesn't feel like me." That statement is accidentally true. It isn't you anymore. Discipline is supposed to feel unnatural at first because it's incompatible with the version of you built on comfort. If it felt natural immediately, it wouldn't change anything. It would just decorate the same weak foundation. When discipline enters your life consistently, it creates an identity gap. Your actions start broadcasting a different signal than your self-concept. That gap is uncomfortable because the mind hates contradiction. It wants alignment, even if the alignment is weak. So it tries to pull you back into old patterns where things make sense again. That pull is not intuition, it's inertia fighting extinction. Men who understand this don't try to feel discipline. They let discipline speak through behavior until the mind is forced to update the story. Identity always follows evidence. When the evidence piles up, early mornings, controlled reactions, executed plans, the mind has no choice but to accept the new standard. You don't convince yourself you're disciplined. You corner your mind with proof until denial becomes impossible. The power in this process is that it doesn't rely on belief. Belief is fragile. Discipline is observable. You either did the work or you didn't. Over time, the repetition of disciplined behavior rewires what feels normal. What once felt extreme becomes baseline. What once felt impossible becomes routine. That's when the old identity goes silent. Not because you fought it, but because it no longer matches reality. This is why discipline is threatening to most people. It doesn't negotiate with who you think you are. It exposes the gap between self-image and self-respect. Comfort allows that gap to exist indefinitely. Discipline closes it violently, and once closed, you can't go back to pretending. That's why men dabble instead of committing. Dabbing preserves excuses. Commitment eliminates them. There's also a status shift that happens internally when discipline takes over. You stop seeking motivation because your actions no longer depend on emotional permission. You stop explaining yourself because the results speak clearly. You stop needing reassurance because your daily behavior confirms who you are. That internal silence is dominance, not over others, but over yourself. The strongest men don't feel like they transformed overnight. They feel like their old self slowly became irrelevant. One disciplined action at a time, the language changed, the standards changed, the identity adjusted, and one day, the behaviors that once felt foreign feel obvious, necessary, non-negotiable. If discipline feels like it doesn't belong to you yet, that's not a flaw. That's the process working. Stay there long enough and your old excuses won't even know how to speak to you anymore. Most men think motivation is the engine of progress. That belief alone keeps them weak. Motivation is a feeling, and feelings are unstable by design. They rise when conditions are favorable and disappear the moment resistance shows up. Building your life on motivation is like building on sand. It looks fine until pressure arrives. Then everything collapses. Obligation, on the other hand, doesn't care about your internal weather. It operates regardless of mood, energy, or confidence. That's why it creates results instead of excuses. The moment you decide something is optional, your mind starts negotiating. Today becomes tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes next week. The task doesn't disappear. It just moves into the category of things you never quite become. Obligation removes that negotiation entirely. When something is non-negotiable, the conversation ends before it begins. You don't ask whether you'll do it. You ask when. That shift alone separates men who talk from men who execute. Motivation feels empowering because it flatters the ego. It tells you that progress happens when you're inspired, aligned, or emotionally ready. Obligation doesn't flatter anything. It reduces life to standards and consequences. Either you met the standard or you didn't. Either you showed up or you failed. There's no emotional padding. That lack of comfort is exactly why obligation works. It strips away self-deception. Men who operate on obligation don't wait for momentum, they create it mechanically. Action produces movement. Movement produces clarity. Clarity produces confidence. This sequence never starts with feeling good. It starts with doing the work despite feeling nothing. Over time, the emotional reward returns, but it's no longer required. That's the upgrade. You're no longer dependent on a psychological spark to function. There's also a deeper psychological shift that happens when obligation becomes the default. You stop identifying as someone who tries. You become someone who delivers. Trying is emotionally safe because it leaves room for excuses. Delivering is binary. It either happened or it didn't. Living in that binary forces honesty. And honesty, while uncomfortable, builds self-respect faster than any motivational speech ever could. Most men avoid obligation because it removes their escape routes. Once something is mandatory, failure becomes personal. There's no one else to blame. That level of accountability is terrifying to an undisciplined mind. So it clings to motivation, inspiration, and external hype, anything that allows inconsistency without guilt. Obligation doesn't allow that luxury. When obligation governs your actions, something unexpected happens. Anxiety drops, decision fatigue disappears. You're no longer constantly choosing what to do next because the standards are already set. That mental clarity feels like confidence to outsiders, but it's really just the absence of internal chaos. Chaos comes from too many options and too little structure. Obligation solves both. This is why elite performers look calm under pressure. They aren't more motivated than everyone else. They're more bound by standards. Their behavior is locked in. Pressure doesn't disrupt them because the decision was made long before the moment arrived. When action is obligatory, pressure loses its leverage. The final trap men fall into is thinking obligation is restrictive. It isn't. It's liberating. Freedom doesn't come from doing whatever you feel like. That's slavery to impulse. Real freedom comes from knowing exactly what must be done and executing without internal resistance. When obligation replaces motivation, your life stops swinging between extremes and starts moving in a straight line. You don't rise to the level of your motivation. You fall to the level of your standards. When standards are enforced through obligation, weakness has nowhere to hide. And once that system is in place, progress becomes inevitable, not inspirational. So understand this clearly. If you're waiting to feel ready, you've already lost. Speak the language through action. Let repetition beat belief into your nervous system. And when the weak version of you can no longer understand what you're doing, that's when you know it's working. This isn't motivation. This is transformation. And it doesn't ask permission.